Blood dripped from Aloan's split lip onto the wooden floor of her tiny cabin as her brother-in-law Marcus Ashford raised his hand again. "Another worthless girl," he snarled, his voice cutting through the Montana Territory morning like a blade. "You've cursed this family twice now, woman." The newborn baby in Aloan's arms whimpered, barely 3 days old, her tiny fingers clutching at the torn fabric of her mother's dress. Behind Marcus, his wife Catherine stood with her arms crossed, her face twisted in disgust as she stared at the exhausted widow. Before we continue, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The slap came hard and fast, snapping Aloan's head to the side. She tasted copper as her teeth cut into her cheek, but she didn't cry out. She couldn't. Not in front of 3-year-old Sarah, who cowered in the corner clutching her rag doll, her wide blue eyes reflecting the terror that had become their daily reality. The cabin that had once felt like home now felt like a prison, its thin walls barely keeping out the harsh Montana wind and doing nothing to muffle the sounds of violence. "Thomas is dead because of you," Catherine hissed, stepping closer to tower over the crouched woman. "My brother worked himself to death in those mines trying to provide for a wife who couldn't even give him a son. And now this." She gestured at the baby with disgust. Another mouth to feed. Another failure. Aloan's arms tightened protectively around her infant daughter Emma, named after her own mother who had died when Aloan was barely older than Sarah. The irony wasn't lost on her that she too might die young, leaving her daughters orphaned in a world that saw them as burdens. The mining accident that took Thomas 6 months ago had left her completely dependent on his family's charity, and their patience had run dry the moment the midwife announced another girl. Marcus grabbed a handful of Aloan's dark hair and yanked her head back, forcing her to look at him. His breath reeked of whiskey, even though the sun had barely risen. "You have 1 week," he growled, his grip tightening until tears sprang to her eyes. "1 week to pack your things and get out of our town. We won't spend another penny keeping you and your mistakes alive. Please," Aloan whispered, her voice barely audible. "I have nowhere to go. The girls need shelter, food." Her plea hung in the air like smoke, dissipating without effect. She had begged before, had promised to work harder, to find ways to contribute despite having no skills that frontier life valued in a woman without a husband. Catherine laughed, a sound as cold as the February wind rattling the cabin's single window. "Should have thought of that before you failed to produce an heir." Twice. She turned toward the door, then paused. "And don't think about staying in this cabin. It belongs to the store, which belongs to us. Come next Sunday. If you're still here, Marcus will make sure you regret it." The door slammed shut with such force that baby Emma startled awake and began to cry. Aloan rocked her gently, her own tears finally falling as she realized the impossible truth. In 7 days, she and her daughters would be homeless in the middle of winter, in a territory where women alone simply didn't survive. The nearest town was 40 miles through snow and wilderness, and even if they somehow made it, she had no money, no family, no prospects. Sarah crept closer, her small hand touching her mother's bruised cheek. "Mama hurt," she whispered. Aloan forced a smile, though it stretched her split lip painfully. "Mama's fine, sweet girl. Everything will be fine." But as she spoke the words, she wondered if this was the last lie she would ever tell her daughters. 3 days passed like a slow death. Aloan had barely slept, spending her nights staring at the cabin's rough ceiling while Emma nursed and Sarah curled against her side for warmth. The Ashfords owned the only general store in Silverbrook, which meant they controlled who ate and who didn't. Word had already spread through the small frontier town that the widow was being cast out, and no one dared cross the family that supplied their flour, medicine, and winter necessities. On the 4th morning, Aloan heard heavy boots approaching the cabin before the sun had fully risen. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders and peered through the frost-covered window. Marcus was striding toward her door, his face set in grim determination, while Catherine followed behind carrying a thick leather strap that made Aloan's stomach turn to ice. The door burst open without a knock. "Time's up," Marcus announced, though 3 days remained of the week he'd given her. His eyes were bloodshot from drinking, and the smell of whiskey filled the small space like a toxic cloud. "You're still here, which means you didn't take our warning seriously enough. Please." Aloan stood slowly, baby Emma cradled in her arms. "You said a week. I'm trying to find somewhere to go, but no one will hire a woman with 2 small children. Just give me the time you promised." Catherine stepped forward with the leather strap, her mouth curved in a cruel smile. "Promises are for people who keep their word. You promised my brother's sons, and instead you gave him shame and an early grave." Sarah pressed herself against the cabin wall, her rag doll clutched so tightly her knuckles had turned white. At 3 years old, she had already learned that when the adults started shouting, pain would follow. Aloan caught her daughter's terrified gaze and tried to convey strength she didn't feel. "The baby is innocent," Aloan said desperately. "Sarah is innocent. Whatever anger you have toward me, don't punish them for something they cannot control." Marcus laughed harshly. "Innocent? They're proof of your failure. Living reminders that you couldn't do the one thing a wife exists for." He grabbed Aloan's arm and twisted it behind her back, causing her to cry out as pain shot through her shoulder. Baby Emma began wailing at the sudden movement. "Hold the brat," Catherine ordered, reaching for the infant. When Aloan resisted, unwilling to let go of her newborn, Catherine struck her across the face with the back of her hand. The blow sent stars across Aloan's vision, and in her moment of weakness, Catherine snatched Emma away. "Now you'll learn what happens to women who defy this family," Marcus snarled. He shoved Aloan hard against the cabin wall, her shoulders striking the rough wood with a sickening thud. Before she could recover, his fist connected with her ribs, driving the air from her lungs in a painful whoosh. The beating was methodical and cruel. Marcus struck her face, her arms, her back, while Catherine held the crying baby and watched with satisfaction. Aloan tried to protect herself, tried to stay standing, but each blow weakened her further. She could hear Sarah sobbing in the corner, could hear Emma's desperate cries, but she couldn't reach either of her children. "Stop!" she gasped when Marcus's boot connected with her stomach, sending her crashing to the floor. "Please, stop. This is what you get for being worthless," Catherine said coldly, bouncing the screaming baby roughly in her arms. "For bringing shame on decent people. Maybe if you tried harder to give Thomas what he needed, he'd still be alive." Blood ran from Aloan's nose and mouth, staining the wooden floor that Thomas had installed so carefully when they'd first been married. She remembered how proud he'd been of this little cabin, how he'd promised it was just the beginning of the life they'd build together. Now it felt like a tomb where his memory was being desecrated by the very people who should have honored it. Marcus grabbed her hair and pulled her face up to meet his eyes. "You have until sunset tomorrow. After that, I'll do worse than this. And next time, your little girls will watch every second of it." When they finally left, slamming the door behind them, Aloan lay motionless on the floor for long minutes. Every breath hurt. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through her battered body. But Sarah's quiet sobs eventually gave her the strength to push herself up and gather her daughters close. Through the thin cabin walls, she could hear neighbors moving about their morning routines. Not one of them had intervened. Not one had even called out to ask if she needed help. In a community where survival depended on looking out for each other, she and her children had become invisible. That night, as Aloan held her daughters and tried to think of anywhere they could go, she realized the truth. Tomorrow's sunset might be the last one they would see together. The stranger rode into Silverbrook just as the morning mist began lifting from the mountains. Draven Mitchell sat tall in his saddle despite the weight of exhaustion that had followed him across 3 territories. His horse's hooves clicked against the frozen ground as he surveyed the small frontier town that looked like every other place he'd tried to call home since the war ended 5 years ago. His weathered hands gripped the reins with the steady control of a man who'd learned to master his trembling. The nightmares still came most nights, filled with cannon smoke and the screams of dying boys who'd barely started shaving. But during the day, He could focus on the simple rhythm of his tools, the satisfaction of building something instead of destroying it. That's what had brought him here, the promise of work rebuilding the church steeple that winter storms had damaged. Draven guided his horse toward the boarding house, a two-story building that had seen better days but still stood solid against the harsh Montana winds. The town seemed smaller than he'd expected, maybe 40 families at most, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. A few people stopped their morning routines to stare at the newcomer, their expressions curious but not unfriendly. "You looking for a room?" called out a woman sweeping her front porch. Her voice carried the careful politeness of someone sizing up a stranger's intentions and wallet. "Yes, ma'am," Draven replied, touching the brim of his worn cavalry hat. "Planning to stay a few weeks, maybe longer if the work holds out." The woman nodded approvingly. "Mrs. Henderson runs a clean house. Fair prices too, long as you don't cause trouble." Her eyes lingered on the carpenter's tools strapped to his saddle and the way he carried himself, straight-backed and alert. "You have the look of a soldier about you." "Used to be," Draven admitted. He'd learned not to elaborate unless pressed. Most folks didn't want to hear war stories, and he preferred not to tell them. "These days I work with wood instead of weapons." After securing his room and settling his horse at the stable, Draven walked the main street to get a feel for the town. Silverbrook had the usual collection of frontier businesses: a blacksmith shop, a small saloon, a church that needed his attention, and the general store that seemed to serve as the town's social center. Through the store's windows, he could see shelves lined with goods and several people engaged in animated conversation. "You the carpenter Henderson mentioned might be coming through?" The voice belonged to a thin man with prematurely gray hair who'd emerged from the store. "Name's Robert Clark. I help coordinate work projects around town." Draven shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip of someone accustomed to manual labor. "Draven Mitchell. Heard you folks need some steeple work done before the spring storms hit." "That we do. Church committee's been worried sick about it collapsing on somebody's head during service." Clark gestured toward the white building at the end of the street, its damaged spire clearly visible against the morning sky. "But I should warn you, there's been some tension in town lately. Might affect who's willing to hire outside help." "What kind of tension?" Draven asked, his instincts sharpening. He'd learned to read the undercurrents in communities, the way hidden conflicts could explode without warning. Clark glanced around nervously, then lowered his voice. "Family dispute that's got everyone choosing sides. The Ashfords own the general store, been here since the town started. They're having trouble with their late son's widow, and it's gotten ugly. Real ugly." Something in the man's tone made Draven's jaw tighten. He'd seen enough ugliness during the war to recognize when people were turning away from something they should be stopping. "What kind of trouble?" "Look, I don't like to gossip," Clark said, though his expression suggested otherwise. "But the woman has been nothing but problems since her husband died. 2 daughters and no way to support them, expecting the family to carry her weight forever. The Ashfords are good Christian people, but charity has its limits." Draven nodded politely, but something felt wrong about the explanation. In his experience, when entire communities agreed on a story too readily, they were usually trying to convince themselves as much as outsiders. "Well, I appreciate the warning. Mostly I just focus on the work anyway." As Clark walked away, Draven studied the general store more carefully. Through the window, he could see a large man with an angry expression gesturing emphatically while others listened with uncomfortable attention. The scene reminded him of officers he'd known during the war, men who used their authority to justify cruelty and called it discipline. That afternoon, while examining the church steeple, Draven overheard more conversations about the widow situation. Each person who mentioned it seemed eager to explain why they couldn't get involved, why it wasn't their place to interfere with family business. The consistency of their excuses made his skin crawl. By evening, as he sat in the boarding house dining room sharing a simple meal with other guests, Draven had heard enough to piece together the basic story. A young woman named Aloan had lost her husband in a mining accident and now lived dependent on his family's charity. She had 2 small daughters, no means of support, and apparently the in-laws had reached the end of their patience. "Shame. Really," said an elderly man at the next table. But a woman alone with children, no skills to speak of, what choice do the Ashfords have? Can't support dead weight forever. Draven set down his fork and looked directly at the speaker. Dead weight. The old man shifted uncomfortably under the carpenter's steady gaze. Well, I mean, she's got to understand the position she's put them in. 2 daughters, no sons to carry on the family name. Sometimes life just doesn't work out the way we hoped. That night, lying on the narrow boarding house bed, Draven stared at the ceiling and tried to ignore the familiar ache in his chest. He'd come to Silverbrook to build something, to find a place where he could settle the restlessness that had driven him from town to town. But already he could feel the old anger stirring, the same fury that had carried him through battles where good men died, defending the right of others to live free. Some fights, he was learning, didn't end when the war did. The scream cut through the morning air like a knife, stopping Draven mid-step as he walked toward the church with his tools. He'd been in Silverbrook 3 days, long enough to notice how conversations stopped when he approached, how people's eyes darted away when the subject of the Ashford family arose. But nothing had prepared him for the sound of pure terror that now echoed from behind the general store. Draven dropped his toolbox and ran toward the source of the scream, his military training taking over as adrenaline flooded his system. Around the corner of the store, a scene unfolded that made his blood turn to ice. A large man with graying hair had a woman pinned against the wooden wall of a small cabin, his meaty fist drawn back for another blow. Blood already streaked her face, and in her arms, she clutched a tiny baby who was wailing in distress. Please, the woman gasped, her voice barely audible over the infant's cries. She's just a baby. Don't hurt her. You should have thought of that before you disgraced this family again, Marcus Ashford snarled, his face twisted with rage. Another worthless girl. Another mouth we can't afford to feed. A small child, no more than 3 years old, cowered near the cabin door, her tiny hands pressed over her ears as tears streamed down her cheeks. The sight of her terror hit Draven like a physical blow, reminding him of other children he'd seen caught in the crossfire of adult cruelty during the war. Behind Marcus, his wife Catherine stood with her arms crossed, watching the violence with cold satisfaction. Hit her again, she commanded. Maybe this time she'll understand that we won't tolerate her failures any longer. Draven's vision began to narrow, the way it had during battle when everything except the immediate threat faded into background noise. He could see townspeople gathering at the edges of the scene, drawn by the commotion but making no move to intervene. Some actually nodded in approval, as if they were watching justice being served rather than a defenseless woman being brutalized. The woman, Aloan, tried to shield her baby when Marcus raised his fist again. The blow caught her across the jaw, snapping her head to the side and sending blood spattering across the cabin wall. She stumbled but didn't fall, her arms still protecting the infant even as her legs shook with the effort of staying upright. That's enough, Draven said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life or death situations. Marcus paused, his fist still raised, and turned to see who had dared interrupt his discipline. This is family business, stranger. Move along before you find yourself in more trouble than you can handle. Draven stepped closer, his hands loose at his sides, but ready to move fast if needed. At 6 feet tall with broad shoulders earned through years of manual labor and military service, he cut an imposing figure. More importantly, his eyes held the steady calm of someone who'd faced real danger and survived. I said that's enough. Do you know who I am? Marcus demanded, his face reddening with indignation. I own the general store. I've been in this town since before you were born, boy. You don't tell me how to handle my own family. Aloan looked up at Draven with desperate hope flickering in her bruised features. Blood ran from her split lip, and her left eye was already beginning to swell shut, but she managed to whisper, "Please don't make it worse for us." The quiet defeat in her voice made something snap inside Draven's chest. He'd heard that same tone from too many victims during the war, people who'd been broken down so thoroughly they feared rescue almost as much as continued suffering. It was the sound of someone who'd learned that hope only led to greater pain. You want to hit someone? Draven asked Marcus, taking another step forward. Try hitting someone who can hit back. Catherine stepped forward, her voice shrill with outrage. How dare you threaten us? Sheriff Collins will hear about this. You'll be run out of town before sunset. Maybe, Draven replied calmly. But right now, this woman and her children are going to walk away from here without anyone laying another finger on them. Marcus laughed harshly. You think you can just ride into our town and tell us how to live? That woman is our responsibility, which means disciplining her is our right. She's failed this family twice, and she'll learn the consequences. Draven moved closer still, near enough that Marcus had to crane his neck to meet his eyes. The only thing I see here is a man twice her size beating a woman holding a baby. Where I come from, we call that cowardice, not discipline. The crowd of townspeople murmured uneasily, some stepping back as they sensed the potential for real violence. Marcus's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, but something in Draven's expression made him hesitate. The carpenter had the look of someone who'd seen death up close and wasn't particularly afraid of it. This is your last warning, stranger, Marcus growled. Walk away now, or you'll regret it. Draven glanced at Aloan, who was swaying on her feet, but still holding her baby protectively. Her older daughter had crept closer, wrapping her small arms around her mother's legs. The sight of the three of them, so vulnerable and alone despite being surrounded by an entire community, made his decision easy. No, he said simply. I don't think I will. Marcus's face went purple with rage. But before he could respond, Draven had closed the distance between them. Years of hand-to-hand combat training made the movement swift and decisive. In one smooth motion, he grabbed Marcus's wrist, twisted it away from his gun, and applied just enough pressure to make the larger man grunt in pain. Now, Draven said quietly, his voice deadly calm. You're going to step away from this woman and her children. And you're going to do it right now. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring, everyone holding their breath to see who would break first. Then, faced with the certainty that Draven meant every word, Marcus took a reluctant step backward. This isn't over, he snarled. Draven looked him directly in the eyes. Yes, it is. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus Ashford stood frozen, his wrist still caught in Draven's iron grip, while the gathered townspeople watched with a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. No one had ever stood up to the Ashfords before, and the air crackled with the tension of a world suddenly turned upside down. Draven released Marcus's wrist and stepped back, but his eyes never left the bigger man's face. Mrs. Aloan, he said without turning around, are you able to walk? Aloan tried to answer, but only managed a weak nod. The beating had left her dizzy and disoriented, and holding baby Emma while standing upright required almost all her remaining strength. Sarah pressed closer against her mother's legs, her small face streaked with tears as she stared at the stranger who'd appeared like something from one of her father's old stories. You have no idea what you've done, Catherine hissed at Draven, her face twisted with fury. This is our town, our family. You're nothing but a drifter who'll be gone in a week. But we have to live with the consequences of her failures every single day. Draven finally turned to look at the woman, and she took an involuntary step backward at the cold assessment in his eyes. The only failure I see here is a community that stands by and watches children terrorized in broad daylight. Marcus flexed his freed hand, trying to restore circulation while his face burned with humiliation. Being outmaneuvered by a stranger in front of half the town would not be easily forgotten or forgiven. You think you're some kind of hero, he spat. Wait until winter really sets in. Wait until she's begging for food and you realize what a burden you've taken on. See how heroic you feel then. That's not your concern anymore, Draven replied calmly. He turned to Aloan, noting how she swayed slightly despite her efforts to remain steady. Ma'am, I need you to listen carefully. You and your daughters are coming with me. Right now. Aloan's swollen eyes widened in confusion and fear. I can't. I have nowhere to go. No money to pay you. I don't even know who you are. My name is Draven Mitchell. I'm a carpenter, and I have somewhere safe you can stay. He glanced meaningfully at Marcus, who was still flexing his sore wrist. Somewhere these people can't reach you. She can't just leave, Catherine protested, panic creeping into her voice as she realized the implications. She owes this family. Her husband died working to support her, and she has debts to pay. Dravan's expression hardened. What debts? The debt of giving birth to daughters instead of sons? The debt of surviving when her husband didn't. He shook his head in disgust. Those aren't debts. Those are just excuses for cruelty. Little Sarah tugged on her mother's torn dress. Mama, is the man going to help us? She whispered, her voice barely audible, but carrying clearly in the tense silence. The innocent question seemed to break something inside Aloan. Fresh tears spilled down her bruised cheeks as she looked at her daughter's hopeful face, then at the baby in her arms who had finally stopped crying and was looking around with wide, curious eyes. The weight of responsibility, of keeping her children alive in a world that saw them as worthless, had been crushing her for months. I don't understand, she said to Dravan, her voice shaking. Why would you help us? You don't know us. We're strangers. Dravan was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant as memories flickered behind his eyes. During the war, I saw a lot of people hurt for things they couldn't control. Saw communities turn against the innocent because it was easier than standing up to the guilty. He looked directly at her, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. I swore I'd never stand by and watch it happen again if I could stop it. Marcus stepped forward, his confidence returning as he remembered his position in the community. You can't just steal our property, Mitchell. That woman and those children belong to this family. There are legal obligations, contracts signed when she married my brother. She's not property, Dravan said quietly, but there was steel in his voice that made several onlookers step back. And those children aren't possessions to be owned. They're human beings who deserve to live without fear. Aloan looked around at the faces surrounding them, seeing the mixture of curiosity, disapproval, and in some cases, barely concealed relief that someone else was taking responsibility for the problem they'd all chosen to ignore. Not one person met her eyes with sympathy or offered support. These people who'd shared meals with her family, who'd celebrated when Sarah was born, who'd mourned with her when Thomas died, were all perfectly willing to watch her be destroyed. Mr. Mitchell, she said softly, I don't want to be anyone's burden. My daughters and I, we've caused enough trouble. Dravan turned to face her fully, and when he spoke, his voice carried a gentleness that surprised everyone present, including himself. Ma'am, you haven't caused any trouble. You've just had the misfortune of needing help in a place where people have forgotten what help looks like. He glanced at baby Emma, who was gazing up at him with dark eyes that reminded him painfully of his youngest sister back in Ohio. These little girls deserve a chance to grow up somewhere they're wanted. And you deserve to heal from what's been done to you. The simple kindness in his words broke down the last of Aloan's resistance. She had been strong for so long, had endured so much, that the offer of genuine help felt like a miracle she was afraid to trust. But looking at her daughters, seeing the hope beginning to kindle in Sarah's eyes, she knew she had to try. All right, she whispered. We'll come with you. Marcus started forward angrily, but Dravan stepped between him and Aloan, his hand resting casually near his own gun. I wouldn't, he advised calmly. This isn't over, Marcus snarled. You can't protect them forever. This is our town, our territory. Eventually, you'll have to leave, and when you do, Dravan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. When I leave, they'll be coming with me. You've lost any claim to these people the moment you decided to solve your problems with your fists. He turned back to Aloan and offered her his arm for support. Let's get you and your daughters somewhere safe. We can figure out the rest later. As they walked away from the crowd, Aloan leaning heavily on Dravan's steady strength while Sarah held tight to her mother's free hand, the townspeople slowly dispersed. Behind them, Marcus and Catherine stood in frustrated fury, watching their control slip away with every step the small group took toward an uncertain but hopeful future. The abandoned homestead sat 3 miles outside Silverbrook, hidden in a grove of pine trees that had grown wild since the last family fled 2 winters ago. Dravan had discovered it during his first day exploring the area. noting how the basic structure remained sound despite broken windows and a roof that leaked in two places. Now, as he helped Aloan down from his horse while balancing baby Emma in one arm and holding Sarah's hand with the other, he saw the property through different eyes. "It's not much," he said quietly, studying Aloan's pale face as she took in the weathered cabin and overgrown yard. "But it's far enough from town that no one will bother you here, and close enough to fresh water." He pointed toward a stream that sparkled through the trees, its gentle sound mixing with the whisper of wind through pine needles. Aloan said nothing, but her silence wasn't disapproval. After months of living under the constant threat of violence, the simple peace of this hidden place felt like stepping into another world. Birds called from the surrounding forest, and the afternoon sun filtered through the trees in golden shafts that made everything look touched by magic. Sarah let go of her mother's hand and took a few tentative steps toward the cabin. "Mama, look," she whispered, pointing at a family of rabbits that froze near the porch before bounding away into the underbrush. It was the first time Aloan had seen her daughter smile in weeks. "Let's get you inside," Draven said, noting how Aloan swayed slightly despite her efforts to appear strong. The beating had taken more out of her than she wanted to admit, and the stress of leaving everything familiar behind was adding to her exhaustion. The cabin's interior was sparse but clean, with a stone fireplace that looked ready to use and furniture left behind by the previous occupants. Dust covered everything, and cold air leaked through gaps in the chinkling, but Draven could already see what needed to be done to make it livable. His carpenter's eye cataloged broken boards, loose hinges, and gaps that would need sealing before the next snowfall. "Sit," he instructed Aloan, guiding her to a wooden chair near the fireplace. "Let me look at those injuries." Aloan stiffened instinctively. Years of Thomas's gentle care followed by months of the Ashford's cruelty, making her wary of any man's touch. But when Draven knelt beside her chair and gently tilted her chin toward the light streaming through the window, his fingers were steady and clinical, like a medic examining a wounded soldier. "Your lip needs cleaning," he said matter-of-factly, producing a clean cloth from his pack. "And that eye is going to swell worse before it gets better. Any broken ribs?" "I don't think so," Aloan replied, though breathing still hurt. She washed his face as he cleaned the dried blood from her split lip, noting the careful concentration in his expression. "Why are you doing this?" "Really?" Draven paused, the cloth still pressed gently against her mouth. For a moment, his careful composure slipped, and she saw something raw and haunted in his eyes. "I had a sister about your daughter's age," he said quietly. "Back in Ohio before the war. Our father used to get drunk and take his frustrations out on whoever was closest." "Used to?" Aloan asked softly. "He killed her during one of his rages. Beat her so badly she never woke up." Draven's voice remained steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he continued cleaning her wounds. "I was 16, thought I was too young to stop him. Told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in family business." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Aloan studied his face, seeing now the weight he carried, the guilt that drove him from town to town searching for a way to make amends for a failure that wasn't really his fault. "You were just a boy," she said gently. "Old enough to know right from wrong. Old enough to stand up to a bully." He finished with her lip and moved to examine the bruising around her eye. "I joined the army the next day. Told myself I'd never let anyone hurt innocent people again if I had the power to stop it." Sarah had been exploring the cabin quietly, her 3-year-old curiosity overcoming her earlier fear. Now she approached Draven cautiously, still clutching her rag doll. "Are you going to stay with us?" she asked with the directness only children possessed. Draven looked at the little girl, seeing his lost sister in her hopeful expression. "For now," he promised. "Until I know you're all safe." While Aloan nursed baby Emma, Draven set about making the cabin livable. He found dry wood in the shed and soon had a fire crackling in the fireplace, filling the space with warmth and dancing light. His pack yielded simple provisions: dried meat, hardtack, and coffee that he brewed in a battered pot over the flames. "You travel well prepared," Aloan observed. accepting a cup of the strong coffee gratefully. The heat felt wonderful in her hands, and the caffeine helped clear some of the fog from her battered head. Military habit, Draven replied, settling cross-legged on the floor near the fire. Always be ready to move. Always be ready to make camp. He watched Sarah curl up on a makeshift bed he'd arranged from blankets and old cushions. I've been moving for 5 years now. Never stayed anywhere longer than a few months. Running from something? Draven considered the question while staring into the flames. Running towards something, maybe. Just never figured out what. He glanced at her, noting how the firelight softened the harsh lines that stress and pain had carved around her eyes. What about you? Before all this, what did you want from life? The question caught Aloan off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked about her wants rather than her failures. I wanted to teach, she said slowly. I loved books, loved learning. Thomas used to say I knew more about history and literature than most men with formal education. What stopped you? I got married instead, had children instead, became what a woman was supposed to become. She looked down at baby Emma, sleeping peacefully in her arms. Don't misunderstand me, I love my daughters. But sometimes I wonder what might have been different if I'd had choices. Draven nodded thoughtfully. Maybe you still do have choices. Different ones than before, but choices all the same. As night fell around the little cabin, the three refugees from Silverbrook's cruelty settled into an uneasy peace. Aloan lay on the rough bed with her daughters pressed close against her, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of wind in the pines and water running over stones. For the first time in months, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. Draven sat by the dying fire, his back against the wall and his gun within easy reach. He'd appointed himself guardian of this small family, and he meant to take the responsibility seriously. Outside, an owl called across the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled its lonely song to the stars. But inside the humble cabin, warmth and safety created their own small world where healing could begin and hope could take root in soil that had been barren for far too long. 2 weeks passed like pages turning in a book Aloan had never dared to read. Each morning brought new discoveries about what life could be when fear wasn't the first emotion to greet the sunrise. Draven worked tirelessly to transform the abandoned homestead into a proper home, his carpenter's skills evident in every repair he made. The leaking roof was patched, the broken windows covered with oiled cloth that still let in light while keeping out the bitter wind, and gaps in the walls sealed tight against the Montana cold. But it was the smaller changes that amazed Aloan most. Draven had carved wooden toys for Sarah, simple animals that made her giggle with delight. He'd built a proper cradle for baby Emma from salvaged lumber, sanding it smooth and lining it with soft fabric from his own spare shirt. When Aloan protested that he was giving up too much for strangers, he'd simply shrugged and said that a baby deserved better than sleeping on the floor. You don't have to do all this, Aloan said one morning as she watched him splitting firewood with methodical precision. Her bruises had faded to yellow and green, and the swelling around her eye had gone down enough that she could see clearly again. We're grateful for the shelter, but I don't want to be a burden. Draven paused in his work, leaning on the axe handle as he studied her face. When's the last time someone did something for you without expecting payment? The question stopped Aloan cold. She realized with a shock that she couldn't remember. Even Thomas, much as she'd loved him, had expected her to fulfill the role of wife and mother in exchange for his provision. The Ashfords had made their expectations brutally clear, but Draven asked for nothing except that she rest and recover while he handled the heavy work. I should be helping more, she insisted. I know how to cook, how to mend clothes. I could earn my keep. You're recovering from being beaten half to death, Draven replied firmly. Your job right now is to get strong again. Everything else can wait. But even as life at the homestead settled into a peaceful rhythm, trouble was brewing back in Silverbrook. The news came through Robert Clark, who rode out on a gray afternoon with his face creased with worry. Draven met him at the edge of the property, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Thought you should know, Clark said without preamble. The Ashfords are stirring up trouble. They've been telling folks you kidnapped Aloan and her girls, that you're living in sin out here like some kind of heathen. Dravan's expression didn't change, but his voice carried a dangerous edge. And what do you think? Clark shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. I think you did what needed doing. But that doesn't matter much when Marcus controls who gets supplies and who doesn't. He's been refusing to sell to anyone who speaks well of you, and winter's coming hard this year. So people are choosing their survival over what's right, Draven said. It wasn't a question. Can you blame them? Families have children to feed, debts to pay. The Ashfords hold the keys to this community's survival. Clark glanced toward the cabin where smoke rose cheerfully from the chimney. How's she doing? The woman, I mean. Her name is Aloan, Draven corrected sharply. And she's doing better than she was when her family was using her as a punching bag. Clark flinched at the blunt description. Look, I'm not saying what they did was right. But there's talk of organizing a group to come out here. Make sure everything's proper and legal. Some of the church women are particularly worked up about the situation. Draven stepped closer to Clark's horse, his posture shifting subtly into something that reminded the older man uncomfortably of stories he'd heard about the war. Let me make something clear. Anyone who comes out here with the intention of dragging that woman and her children back to town will find more trouble than they bargained for. I'm just the messenger, Clark said quickly. But you should know that Sheriff Collins is under pressure to investigate. Questions about whether you have legal right to take her from her husband's family, whether there are debts that need settling. After Clark left, Draven stood watching the road for a long time. He'd known this peace couldn't last forever, but he'd hoped for more time. Time for Aloan to fully heal. Time for the girls to feel truly safe. Time for him to figure out a more permanent solution to their situation. When he returned to the cabin, he found Aloan teaching Sarah her letters, using a charred stick to write on a piece of smooth wood. The domestic scene made something twist in his chest, a longing for the kind of normal life that had always seemed just out of reach. Trouble? Aloan asked, noting the tension in his shoulders. Draven hesitated, then decided she deserved the truth. The Ashfords are spreading stories about us, saying I kidnapped you, that we're living improperly out here. Aloan's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. What kind of stories? The kind that get people worked up enough to form groups and ride out here to set things right. Draven sat down across from her, his expression serious. They're also questioning whether I had any legal right to take you away from your husband's family. Legal right, Aloan repeated bitterly, as if I'm property to be transferred between owners. She looked down at Sarah, who was still concentrating on forming her letters, blissfully unaware of the adult conversation happening over her head. What do you think they'll do? They'll come eventually, probably led by the sheriff, maybe with some of the church committee to give it the appearance of respectability. Dravan's hand moved unconsciously to his gun. Question is, what do you want to do about it? Aloan was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rough wood of the table. When she looked up, there was something new in her eyes, a strength that hadn't been there before. I want to fight, she said quietly. For the first time in my life, I want to stand up and fight for something that's mine. And what's yours? Draven asked softly. Aloan looked around the simple cabin that had become more of a home in 2 weeks than the Ashfords' place had ever been. She looked at her daughters, who were thriving in an environment free from fear and judgment. And she looked at Draven, this strange, gentle man who'd given them sanctuary when the whole world had turned its back. This, she said simply, all of this, my daughter's right to grow up safe, my right to make choices about my own life. And maybe, she paused, color rising in her cheeks, maybe the right to choose who I want to share that life with. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the oiled cloth over the windows and sending pine needles skittering across the roof. But inside the cabin, surrounded by warmth and the growing certainty that some things were worth fighting for, Aloan felt stronger than she had in years. The storm was coming, but this time, she wouldn't face it alone. They came at dawn on a Tuesday, when the morning mist still clung to the pine trees and frost sparkled on the cabin's rough walls. Draven had been expecting them for days, his soldier's instincts keeping him alert to every sound from the forest. He spotted the riders when they were still half a mile away, A group of 8 men, led by Sheriff Collins with Marcus Ashford riding close beside him. Alone, Draven called softly through the cabin door. It's time. She emerged quickly, baby Emma in her arms, and Sarah pressed close against her skirts. Over the past week, they'd talked through this moment countless times, planning what they would say and do when the confrontation finally came. But now that it was here, Aloan felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. "Remember," Draven said quietly, checking his rifle one last time before leaning it against the cabin wall within easy reach. "You don't owe them explanations. You don't owe them apologies. You're a grown woman making choices about your own life." The riders approached slowly, their horses' hooves muffled by the thick layer of pine needles covering the ground. Sheriff Collins was a thin man in his 50s who'd kept peace in Silverbrook more through avoiding trouble than confronting it. Behind him rode Marcus and Catherine Ashford, their faces set in grim determination, followed by 5 other men from town, including the banker, the preacher, and 3 members of the church committee. "Mitchell," Sheriff Collins called out when they were still 20 yards away. "We need to talk." "Then talk," Draven replied, stepping into the clearing but staying close enough to the cabin that he could reach his rifle quickly. "Though I should mention that this is private property, and you're not particularly welcome here." Marcus urged his horse forward, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "That woman belongs with her husband's family. You had no right to take her." "I didn't take anyone," Draven said calmly. "I offered help to someone who needed it." "Big difference." Reverend Hampton, a pompous man who'd rarely shown concern for Aloan's welfare when she was being beaten, cleared his throat importantly. "Mr. Mitchell, there are proper procedures for these situations. The church has protocols for caring for widows and orphans. What you've done here, living alone with an unmarried woman, creates the appearance of impropriety." "The appearance of impropriety," Draven repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "And what would you call a man beating a woman holding a baby? What's the proper church protocol for that?" The Reverend shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Family discipline is a private matter. The Bible clearly states that wives should be subject to their husbands, and by extension, their husband's family. Her husband is dead," Draven pointed out. "Has been for 8 months. Exactly whose authority is she supposed to be subject to now?" Before anyone could answer, Aloan stepped out of the cabin. She dressed carefully for this moment, wearing her best remaining dress and holding her head high despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. Baby Emma gurgled contentedly in her arms, while Sarah clung to her mother's skirt but watched the proceedings with bright, curious eyes. "Gentlemen," Aloan said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing, "I understand you have concerns about my situation." Marcus leaned forward in his saddle, his expression shifting to what he probably thought was fatherly concern but looked more like barely controlled rage. "Aloan, you need to come home. This has gone on long enough. You belong with family, not living in sin with some stranger." "Living in sin," Aloan repeated, raising an eyebrow. "I'm curious, Marcus. When you were beating me in front of my children, was that living in virtue?" Several of the men exchanged uncomfortable glances. The Reverend cleared his throat again. "Mrs. Harwick, surely you understand that your situation requires guidance. A woman alone cannot make proper decisions about moral and financial matters." "I see," Aloan said thoughtfully. "So when I decided to stay in an abusive situation because I had no other choice, that was a proper decision. But when I chose to accept help from someone who treated me with kindness, that requires guidance." Sheriff Collins finally spoke up, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. "Ma'am, there are legal questions here. Questions about debts your late husband owed, about your responsibility to his family." "What debts?" Draven asked sharply. "Specifically," the sheriff looked to Marcus, who fumbled for an answer. "Well, there's the matter of support we provided during her lying-in period. Food, shelter, medical attention." "You mean the food you withheld as punishment?" Aloan asked sweetly. "The shelter in a cabin that belonged to my husband, not you? The medical attention that consisted of telling me I was cursed for bearing daughters?" Catherine finally spoke up, her voice shrill with frustration. "You ungrateful creature. We took you in when you had nothing, gave you a roof over your head, food for your children. This is how you repay our Christian charity. Charity, Eloan repeated, and for the first time, her voice carried an edge that made several horses sidestep nervously. Is that what you call beating a woman 3 days after she gave birth? Is that what you call threatening to throw children out in the snow because they had the audacity to be born female? Sarah looked up at her mother with wide eyes, hearing a strength in Eloan's voice that she'd never heard before. Even baby Emma seemed to sense the change, gazing around alertly at the circle of men and horses. The point is, Reverend Hampton said pompously, that proper Christian women don't run off with strange men and set up housekeeping in the wilderness. There are standards of behavior that must be maintained. Eloan took a step forward, her eyes blazing. Standards of behavior? Where were these standards when I was being brutalized? Where was the church when my children were watching their mother beaten bloody? You want to talk about Christian behavior? Show me the Christianity in watching suffering and doing nothing to stop it. The accusation hit home, and several of the men looked away uncomfortably. They all knew what had been happening to Eloan, and they all knew they'd chosen to look the other way rather than confront the Ashfords. Furthermore, Eloan continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. I am not setting up housekeeping with anyone. Mr. Mitchell has been nothing but honorable in his treatment of me and my daughters. He's provided shelter, protection, and respect, all things I was denied by my husband's so-called loving family. Marcus's face was turning purple with rage. You can't just walk away from your obligations, woman. You belong to this family now. We have rights. Rights. Eloan's voice cracked like a whip. What rights exactly? The right to beat me? The right to terrorize my children? The right to call them worthless because they're girls? She stepped closer to his horse, and something in her expression made the animal back up nervously. Let me make something very clear, Marcus Ashford. I am not your property. My daughters are not your property. We don't belong to you or anyone else. Sheriff Collins raised a placating hand. Now, Mrs. Harwick, let's all stay calm here. The law requires that we investigate when there are allegations of improper behavior. Then investigate, Draven said suddenly, his quiet voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Look around. See any evidence of improper behavior? See any signs that these children are being mistreated or neglected? The men looked reluctantly around the small homestead. The cabin was clearly well maintained, with smoke rising cheerfully from the chimney and neat piles of chopped wood stacked against the walls. Sarah looked healthy and bright-eyed, and baby Emma was obviously thriving. Even Eloan herself looked better than she had in months, her bruises healed and her posture straight with newfound confidence. The situation appears adequate, the sheriff admitted reluctantly. Adequate. Eloan laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Sheriff Collins, in the 8 months since my husband died, this is the first time anyone has asked whether my children and I are being properly cared for. The first time anyone has shown concern for our welfare rather than our compliance. She looked around the circle of men, meeting each pair of eyes steadily. You want to know what improper behavior looks like? It looks like a community that protects bullies and abandons victims. It looks like men who call themselves Christian while watching children terrorized. It looks like all of you, sitting on your horses, trying to drag us back to a situation you know is wrong, because it's easier than admitting you failed to protect us when we needed you. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the horses seemed to sense the weight of her words, shifting restlessly as their riders struggled with the uncomfortable truth she'd laid before them. Finally, Draven spoke into the quiet. I think you gentlemen have your answer. Mrs. Harwick and her daughters are exactly where they choose to be. Unless you have some legal authority to force them elsewhere, I suggest you head back to town. Marcus started to protest, but Sheriff Collins held up a hand. He'd seen enough to know that any attempt to force the issue would likely end in violence, and he wasn't eager to test his authority against a man who'd clearly seen real combat. This matter is far from settled. Marcus snarled as the group began to turn their horses around. Yes, it is, Eloan said quietly, but her voice carried clearly to every man present. It's more settled than it's ever been. As the riders disappeared back into the forest, Aloan felt something shift inside her chest, like a door that had been locked for years finally swinging open. She'd found her voice, and she intended to keep using it. The silence after the riders left felt different from any quiet Aloan had ever experienced. It wasn't the terrified hush of waiting for the next blow or the empty stillness of despair. This was the profound peace that comes after a storm passes, when the air feels clean and full of possibilities that hadn't existed before. Draven watched her carefully as she stood in the clearing, baby Emma still cradled in her arms, while Sarah pressed close against her legs. Something fundamental had changed in Aloan during the confrontation, something that went deeper than just finding her voice. She stood taller now, her shoulders squared with a confidence that made her seem like an entirely different woman from the broken creature he'd rescued weeks ago. "You were magnificent," he said quietly, and meant every word. Aloan turned to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears that weren't born of sadness, but of something closer to wonder. "I've never stood up to anyone like that before. Never in my entire life. How does it feel?" She considered the question seriously, tilting her head as she examined the sensation of speaking her truth without fear of consequence. "Terrifying," she admitted, "and absolutely wonderful." Sarah tugged on her mother's skirt, looking up with the solemn expression that sometimes made her seem far older than her 3 years. "Are the bad men going to come back, Mama?" Aloan knelt down so she could look directly into her daughter's eyes, shifting Emma to one arm so she could stroke Sarah's soft hair with her free hand. "I don't think so, sweetheart. But if they do, Mama won't let them hurt us anymore. Promise. I promise." It was a vow that would have felt impossible just hours ago, but now Aloan spoke it with absolute certainty. She'd discovered something about herself during the confrontation, a core of steel that had been buried under years of being told she was weak, worthless, dependent. That steel was still there, waiting to be forged into whatever shape she needed it to take. As the days passed, life at the homestead settled into a new rhythm. The threat of forced removal had passed, but more importantly, the dynamic between Draven and Aloan had shifted in ways that neither of them had fully anticipated. Where before there had been gratitude and growing friendship, now there was something deeper, more complex. Draven found himself watching Aloan as she went about her daily tasks, marveling at how different she seemed from the broken woman he'd rescued. She hummed while she cooked, laughed at Sarah's silly games, and carried herself with a grace that had nothing to do with submission and everything to do with inner strength. When she caught him looking, she didn't blush and look away as she might have weeks ago. Instead, she met his gaze with a steady warmth that made his heart race. For her part, Aloan was discovering what it meant to be valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. Draven sought out her opinions on everything from how to arrange the furniture to what stories she remembered from her childhood. He listened when she talked about her dreams of teaching, asking thoughtful questions that showed he took her intelligence seriously. When she mentioned missing books, he rode into the next town over and returned with 3 volumes of poetry that made her cry with joy. The turning point came on a cold evening in early December, when snow was falling softly outside the cabin and the fire crackled warmly in the stone hearth. Sarah had fallen asleep on the rug near the flames, her rag doll clutched in her arms, while Emma dozed in her wooden cradle. Aloan sat mending one of Draven's shirts, her needle flashing in the firelight as she worked. "You don't have to do that," Draven said from his seat across the room, where he was carving a wooden horse for Sarah's upcoming birthday. "I want to," Aloan replied simply. "You've done so much for us. It feels good to do something useful for you." Draven set down his carving and looked at her seriously. "Aloan, you don't owe me anything. You never have. What I did because it was right, not because I expected payment. I know that." She paused in her sewing to meet his eyes. "That's what makes it different." The statement hung between them, loaded with meaning that neither of them had spoken aloud, but both understood perfectly. This wasn't about debt or obligation or the careful transaction that most marriages represented in their world. This was about choice, about 2 people who'd found something precious in each other's company. "Aloan," Draven said carefully, "I need to tell you something." She set down her mending, sensing the importance of whatever he was about to say. "What is it?" "I'm falling in love with you." The words came out quietly but clearly, without hesitation or apology. "Not with the idea of you, not with gratitude or convenience, but with you." The woman who teaches her daughter letters by firelight. The woman who stood up to 8 men today and made them ashamed of themselves. The woman who hums while she cooks and argues with me about politics and makes me want to stay in one place for the first time in 5 years. Aloan's breath caught in her throat. She'd wondered, hoped, but hearing the words spoken aloud made them real in a way that sent warmth flooding through her entire body. "Draven, I know it's complicated," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "I know you're still healing from everything that happened. I know people will talk, will say we're moving too fast, or that you're just grateful. But I also know that what I feel for you is real, and I hope, that maybe you feel something similar." Aloan stood up slowly, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. She crossed the small space between them and knelt beside his chair, placing her hands over his as they rested on the carved horse. "I do feel something similar," she said softly. "More than similar. Draven, you saved my life in every way a person can be saved. You gave me back my dignity, my strength, my hope. But more than that, you showed me what love actually looks like." "What do you mean?" "Love isn't control. It isn't ownership or possession or the right to hurt someone when they disappoint you." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, her eyes never leaving his face. "Love is what you did when you stepped between me and Marcus. Love is building toys for my daughter even though you barely knew us. Love is listening to my opinions and treating them as valuable. Love is seeing me as a person instead of a problem to be solved." Draven reached up to cup her face gently in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize had started falling. "Then maybe we can figure out what that kind of love looks like together." "Is that a proposal, Mr. Mitchell?" "It's whatever you want it to be, Mrs. Harwick. But if you're asking whether I want to marry you, build a life with you, help raise your beautiful daughters, and maybe have a few more children of our own, then yes. Yes, it's absolutely a proposal." Aloan's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face with joy. "Then yes, it's absolutely a yes." When Draven kissed her, it was gentle and reverent, like a promise made sacred by the fire's warm light and the snow falling softly outside. It was the kiss of two people who'd found in each other not just love, but the possibility of healing, of wholeness, of a future that belonged entirely to them. Sarah stirred on her rug, blinking sleepy eyes at the two adults who were holding each other close beside the dying fire. "Are you happy, Mama?" she asked drowsily. Aloan looked down at her daughter, then at baby Emma sleeping peacefully in her cradle, then at Draven whose arms held her like she was something precious beyond measure. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "Mama is very, very happy." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in pristine white that made everything look fresh and new. Inside the little cabin, three people who'd been broken by the cruelty of others had found a way to become whole together, creating something beautiful from the fragments of their separate sorrows. And for the first time since she was a little girl dreaming of the life she might someday have, Aloan fell asleep knowing that tomorrow would bring joy instead of fear, love instead of survival, and hope instead of despair. 5 years had transformed the abandoned homestead into something that looked like it belonged in a storybook. The cabin had been expanded with 2 additional rooms. The roof was solid and leak-proof, and gardens flourished where once only weeds had grown. A barn housed chickens, 2 goats, and the horses that Draven bred and trained for sale to travelers passing through the territory. Most importantly, the property hummed with the sound of children's laughter, a sound that had drawn other families seeking refuge from situations that seemed hopeless. Aloan Mitchell stood on the porch she'd helped design, watching her husband teach 8-year-old Sarah how to properly hold a hammer while 4-year-old Emma attempted to help by gathering bent nails into a rusty can. At her side, 2-year-old James tugged impatiently at her skirt, eager to join his sisters in whatever important work was happening near the new chicken coop. "Mama, can I go help Papa?" James asked, his vocabulary impressive for his age, but his pronunciation still charmingly unclear. "In a moment, little man," Eloan replied, smoothing his dark hair that was so much like his father's. "Let Papa finish showing Sarah the proper way first." The scene filled her with a contentment that still sometimes caught her by surprise. After years of believing happiness was something that happened to other people, she'd learned to recognize and treasure these ordinary moments that made up an extraordinary life. Her children grew up knowing they were valued simply for existing, not for what gender they happened to be or what they might accomplish. Sarah was learning carpentry alongside her letters because she'd shown interest in building things. Emma was learning to care for the animals because she had a natural gentleness with creatures that needed tending. And James was learning that men could be gentle and patient teachers instead of sources of fear. The sound of an approaching wagon made Eloan look up from her domestic reverie. A covered wagon was making its way slowly up the dirt path that led to their homestead, and she could see a woman's figure hunched over the reins while small faces peered out from the canvas covering. Her heart clenched with recognition, even though she'd never seen these particular people before. She knew that look, that posture, that desperate hope mixed with bone-deep exhaustion. "Dravan," she called softly, and something in her voice made him look up immediately from his lesson with Sarah. He followed her gaze to the approaching wagon, and his expression grew serious. They'd had visitors like this before, women fleeing situations that had become unbearable, drawn by stories that had somehow spread across the territory about a place where people could find sanctuary and a fresh start. The woman driving the wagon was young, maybe 22, with prematurely gray streaks in her brown hair and the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd been running on fear and determination for too long. Two children sat beside her, a boy of perhaps 6 and a girl who couldn't have been more than 4, both of them thin and wary in the way that children became when the adults in their lives were constantly afraid. "Ma'am," the woman called out when she was close enough to be heard without shouting. "I'm looking for Eloan Mitchell. I heard people said that maybe she might help someone in trouble." Eloan stepped down from the porch, her movements careful and non-threatening. She'd learned over the years how to approach frightened people, how to offer help without overwhelming someone who'd been hurt by those who should have protected them. "I'm Eloan," she said simply. "What's your name?" "Margaret Crenshaw," the woman replied, her voice shaking slightly. "These are my children, Peter and Lucy. We've been traveling for 2 weeks, and I don't know where else to go." "What happened to you, Margaret?" Margaret's face crumpled, and for a moment, she looked like she might break down completely. "My husband died in a logging accident 3 months ago. His brother took over the business, said I could stay if I became his wife too. When I refused, he said I was being ungrateful, that he'd throw us out with nothing." She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself. "Last week he tried to force himself on me. That's when I knew we had to leave." Eloan felt the familiar surge of anger that always came when she heard stories like Margaret's. The details might be different, but the pattern was always the same. Women left vulnerable by tragedy, taken advantage of by men who saw desperation as opportunity, communities that looked the other way rather than get involved in family business. "You did the right thing leaving," Eloan said firmly. "You and your children are safe here." "I don't have any money," Margaret said quickly. "I can work, I can earn my keep, but I can't pay you anything up front." "Money isn't what matters here," Draven said, approaching the wagon with the same careful movements Eloan had used. "What matters is that you and your children are safe and have what you need to build a new life." Over the next several hours, as Margaret and her children were settled into the small guest cabin that Dravan had built specifically for situations like this, Eloan found herself thinking about how much had changed since that terrible morning when Marcus Ashford had beaten her for the crime of giving birth to a daughter. The woman she'd been then, broken and convinced of her own worthlessness, seemed like a stranger now. That evening, after Margaret's children had been fed and bathed and tucked into warm beds, the adults sat around the kitchen table planning practical next steps. Margaret had skills as a seamstress, and there was always demand for quality needlework in the growing territory. Draven knew of a woman in the next town who might need help with her dressmaking business. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be possible, and most importantly, it would be Margaret's choice to make. I don't understand why you're helping me, Margaret said, her voice thick with exhaustion and gratitude. You don't know me, don't owe me anything. Aloan smiled, remembering asking Draven the exact same question 5 years ago. Someone helped me once when I needed it most. Someone saw that I was worth saving even when I couldn't see it myself. Now it's my turn to pass that gift along. Will I ever feel strong again? Margaret asked quietly. Will there ever come a time when I'm not afraid? Yes, Aloan said with absolute certainty. There will come a time when you wake up in the morning and realize you're not afraid anymore. When you make decisions because you wanna, not because you have to. When you look at your children and know that they're growing up seeing their mother as someone powerful and brave instead of someone to be pitied. Later that night, as Aloan and Draven lay in their own bed listening to the peaceful sounds of their sleeping children, they talked quietly about the future they were building together. Robert Clark stopped by while you were settling Margaret, Draven said. He had news from town. Good news or bad news? Depends on how you look at it. Marcus Ashford's store is failing. People have been taking their business to the new merchant who set up shop near the train station. Word is that Marcus's reputation for cruelty finally caught up with him. Aloan was quiet for a moment, processing this information. There was a time when news of Marcus's downfall would have filled her with vindictive satisfaction. Now, she found she felt mostly indifferent to his fate. He'd become irrelevant to her life, a problem she'd outgrown rather than an enemy to be defeated. And Catherine, she asked, left him last month, took what money was left and moved back east to live with her sister. Draven paused. Clark also said that 3 more women have asked about coming here. Word is spreading about what we're doing. Aloan nodded thoughtfully. They'd always known that their small sanctuary couldn't remain secret forever. The question was whether they were ready to expand their mission, to become something more than just a safe haven for a few desperate families. What do you think? Draven asked. I think, Aloan said slowly, that there are a lot of Margaret Crenshaws out there. A lot of women who need to know that someone believes they're worth saving. Maybe it's time we stopped hiding our light under a bushel. That sounds like the schoolteacher talking. Aloan laughed softly. She's been wanting to come out for a while now. Sarah's getting old enough that she needs more formal education, and I've been thinking about starting a small school here. Not just for our children, but for any families in the area who want their daughters to learn more than just sewing and cooking. A school that teaches girls they can be anything they want to be. A school that teaches all children that their worth isn't determined by their gender or their family's money or what other people expect from them. Aloan turned to face her husband in the darkness. A place where children learn that kindness is stronger than cruelty, that love is more powerful than fear, and that sometimes one person's courage to do what's right can change everything. Draven pulled her closer, marveling as he always did at the strength and vision of the woman he'd fallen in love with. Then let's build it, he said simply. Let's build something so beautiful and strong that it lasts long after we're gone. Outside their window, the Montana sky stretched endlessly above the peaceful homestead, filled with more stars than seemed possible. In the guest cabin, Margaret Crenshaw slept deeply for the first time in months, her children safe beside her, and hope beginning to take root in soil that had seemed too barren to grow anything good. And in the main house, surrounded by the family they'd created together, Aloan and Draven Mitchell dreamed of the future they would build, one act of courage at a time, one rescued family at a time, one child taught to believe in their own worth at a time. The little girl who'd cowered in the corner while her mother was beaten had grown into a woman who stood fearlessly between the powerful and the powerless, who'd learned that the greatest revenge against cruelty was to fill the world with so much love and justice that darkness had nowhere left to hide. And every morning when she woke up in the home she'd helped build, surrounded by the people she'd chosen to love and who'd chosen to love her back, Aloan Mitchell knew with absolute certainty that some stories really do have happy endings, especially the ones where broken people refuse to stay broken and choose instead to help others heal. The legacy of that choice would ripple outward for generations. touching lives not yet born, and creating possibilities not yet imagined. All because one man had seen injustice and refused to walk away, and one woman had found the courage to believe that she deserved better than the cruelty the world had shown her. Sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything. If this story of courage, love, and second chances touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Tomorrow, we'll bring you another incredible true tale of ordinary people who refused to accept that life had to be unfair, who chose hope over despair, and who proved that love really can conquer all. You won't want to miss it.